When Grandpa died and left me his 160-acre farm, my family's reaction was a mixture of pity and barely concealed amusement. The land had been considered worthless for over 30 years, ever since the wells went dry and the last successful harvest withered in the brutal drought of 1988. "Poor Tommy," my Aunt Sarah said at the funeral reception, "stuck with that dried-up wasteland while the rest of us got the good properties." My cousins had inherited the profitable farms on the east side of the county, where irrigation systems and reliable water sources made farming a predictable business. I got the place everyone called the Dust Bowl, 160 acres of cracked earth that hadn't produced a decent crop since Ronald Reagan was president. The family's attitude was clear. I'd drawn the short straw in the inheritance lottery. They offered to buy the land from me for a fraction of its assessed value, suggesting I use the money to start fresh somewhere else. "There's no point trying to farm that place," my cousin Jake told me. "Grandpa tried for 40 years and never made it work. The soil's shot, the water table's gone, and even if you could grow something, it wouldn't be enough to pay the property taxes." But something about their eagerness to see me give up made me stubborn. Grandpa had loved that land with a passion that bordered on obsession. He'd spent every day of his retirement walking those fields, taking notes in leather-bound journals, and talking about the potential that others couldn't see. I'd inherited those journals along with the land, and reading through them revealed a man who hadn't given up despite decades of failure. His final entry, written just weeks before his death, was particularly intriguing. "The land remembers. The blessing will return when the time is right. Tommy will understand what I could not." I decided to give farming a try, despite everyone's predictions of failure. I had some savings from my job in town, enough to buy seed and basic equipment. If I failed, at least I'd fail on my own terms. Chapter 2. The Skeptical Beginning. I quit my job at the agricultural supply store and moved into Grandpa's old farmhouse in March. The place needed work, leaky roof, outdated plumbing, and windows that rattled in the wind, but it was functional enough for a bachelor farmer starting from scratch. My first priority was assessing the land's condition. I walked every acre, taking soil samples and noting the variations in terrain and drainage. What I found wasn't encouraging. The topsoil was thin and dusty, the subsoil was hardpan clay, and there were no obvious water sources beyond a few seasonal creeks that had been dry for years. The old well house contained a pump that hadn't worked since the water table dropped below the reach of conventional drilling. Grandpa's irrigation equipment sat rusted and abandoned in the barn, a monument to failed hopes and wasted investment. But as I read through his journals, I began to notice patterns in his observations that others had missed. He'd documented microclimates within the property, noting areas where morning dew lasted longer and where certain native plants thrived despite the overall aridity. Grandpa had also tracked weather patterns with obsessive detail, recording not just rainfall amounts but wind directions, cloud formations, and atmospheric pressure readings. His notes suggested that the property experienced unusual weather phenomena that didn't affect neighboring farms. "The rain comes different here," he'd written in 1995. "Not when the weather service says it should, but when the land calls for it. I've seen clouds form over the North 40 when the sky was clear everywhere else." I dismissed such observations as the fantasies of an old man desperate to find hope in a hopeless situation. But as I prepared to plant my first crop, I began to wonder if Grandpa had noticed something that meteorologists and agricultural experts had overlooked. I decided to plant corn, choosing a drought-resistant variety that could survive on minimal water. It was a conservative choice, but given the land's history, conservative seemed wise. The planting went smoothly, and I had 120 acres of corn in the ground by mid-April. Now all I could do was wait and hope for rain. Chapter 3. The dry spell begins. May passed without significant rainfall, and by June the entire region was officially in drought conditions. My neighbors' irrigated fields remained green and healthy, but my corn was struggling to emerge from the parched soil. My family's predictions seemed to be coming true. Jake stopped by regularly to check on my progress, each visit an opportunity to remind me that I could still sell the land and cut my losses. "You've got maybe another month before those plants die completely," he said during one particularly brutal visit in early July. "The smart thing would be to disc it under and plant something that doesn't need water." "Like what?" I asked. "Nothing," he replied with a grin. "Just let it go back to pasture. Maybe run a few cattle on it if you can find water for them to drink." The local agricultural extension agent was more diplomatic but equally pessimistic. "I admire your determination," he told me, "but this land has been marginal for decades. Without irrigation, you're basically gambling on weather patterns that haven't favored this area since the 1970s. Even the bank was getting nervous. I'd taken out a small operating loan to cover seed and equipment costs, and the loan officer called to discuss my repayment plans. "We're not trying to pressure you," he said carefully, "but we need to know that you have a realistic plan for making this work. The drought isn't showing any signs of breaking, and your crop insurance won't cover much if the plants never establish properly." I spent my evenings reading Grandpa's journals, looking for clues about how he'd maintained his optimism despite decades of similar challenges. His entries from drought years were particularly detailed, documenting his observations about soil moisture, plant behavior, and atmospheric conditions. One entry from the drought of 1988 caught my attention. The old-timers used to say this land was blessed by the spirits of the original inhabitants. I always thought that was superstition, but I'm beginning to wonder if there's something here that science hasn't explained yet. As July wore on, and my corn plants grew smaller and more stressed each day, I found myself hoping that Grandpa's blessing was more than just wishful thinking. Chapter 4. Signs and Portents. By late July, my corn was clearly failing. The plants were stunted and yellowing, their leaves curled against the relentless sun. Neighboring farmers with irrigation were harvesting their first cutting of alfalfa, while my fields looked like a moonscape. But I began noticing small things that didn't quite fit the pattern of total agricultural failure. Certain areas of the farm seemed to retain moisture longer than others, and some of my corn plants were actually thriving despite the drought conditions. These healthy plants were scattered seemingly at random across the property, with no obvious correlation to soil type, elevation, or proximity to old water sources. But when I plotted their locations on a map, I noticed they formed rough lines that corresponded to features Grandpa had marked in his journals. He'd identified what he called spirit lines, paths across the property where native plants grew more vigorously and where he'd observed unusual weather phenomena over the years. I'd assumed these were just the wanderings of an old man's imagination, but the pattern of healthy corn plants suggested otherwise. I also began noticing changes in local wildlife behavior. Birds that had been absent from the area for years started appearing in flocks, and I saw deer and other animals crossing the property at dawn and dusk. Grandpa had noted similar animal behavior in his journals, always in the weeks before unexpected rainfall. The atmospheric conditions were changing too. While the rest of the region remained locked in high-pressure systems that prevented cloud formation, I began seeing small, cumulus clouds developing over my property in the late afternoons. They never produced rain, but their presence was unusual enough to catch the attention of the local weather service. "We're seeing some interesting microclimate effects in your area," the meteorologist told me when I called to ask about the cloud formations. "It's probably related to thermal updrafts from the bare soil, but the patterns are more persistent than we'd normally expect." My family remained skeptical of any signs of hope. "Clouds don't mean rain," Jake reminded me during another visit. "And even if you get a little moisture, it's too late to save this year's crop. You should start thinking about what you're going to plant next spring." But Grandpa's journal suggested that dramatic weather changes often happened quickly on this property, sometimes within a matter of hours. His most detailed account was from August 1976, when a severe drought had broken suddenly with what he described as a miracle storm that came from nowhere. Chapter 5. The First Miracle. It happened on August 15th, during what meteorologists later called one of the most unusual weather events in regional history. I was walking through the dying corn, checking for any signs of life worth salvaging, when I noticed the sky beginning to change. Dark clouds were forming directly overhead, but only over my property. The neighboring farms remained under clear blue skies, and the weather radar showed no precipitation in the area. Yet I could feel the atmospheric pressure dropping and smell the distinctive scent of approaching rain. Within 30 minutes, the clouds had developed into a full thunderstorm, complete with lightning, thunder, and heavy rainfall. But the storm's boundaries were precisely defined. Rain fell only on my 160 acres, while farmers just across the fence line watched in amazement as their fields remained bone dry. The rain lasted for exactly 2 hours, delivering nearly 3 inches of precipitation to soil that hadn't seen significant moisture in months. I stood in the middle of my cornfield, soaked to the skin, watching water pool in furrows that had been cracked and dusty that morning. When the storm passed, the contrast was surreal. My property was muddy and green with the smell of wet earth, while the surrounding landscape remained brown and parched. The boundary between wet and dry soil followed my property lines with mathematical precision. My phone started ringing within minutes. Neighbors, family members, and local officials all wanted to know what had happened. The local weather service sent a team to investigate, but they found no meteorological explanation for the localized storm. "We've never seen anything quite like this," the lead meteorologist admitted. "Isolated thunderstorms are common, but this one formed and dissipated over a very specific area with no apparent atmospheric trigger." My family's reaction was a mixture of amazement and suspicion. "It's just a fluke," Jake insisted. "One storm doesn't change the fact that this land is marginal. You'll need consistent rainfall to make farming viable here." But Grandpa's journals suggested that this was exactly how the blessing worked. Not through consistent weather patterns, but through precisely timed interventions that provided exactly what the land needed when it needed it most. Within days, my corn plants began recovering from their drought stress, growing rapidly in the moisture-rich soil. Chapter 6. The Pattern Emerges. Over the next month, the localized weather phenomenon repeated itself 3 more times. Each storm followed the same pattern, clouds forming only over my property, heavy rainfall lasting exactly 2 hours, then clear skies returning while neighboring farms remained dry. The meteorological community was baffled. Teams from the National Weather Service, university research programs, and private weather companies came to study the site, but none could explain why atmospheric conditions over my 160 acres were so different from the surrounding area. "There's no topographical reason for this," Dr. Sarah Martinez from the State University told me after conducting extensive atmospheric measurements. "Your property isn't significantly higher or lower than the surrounding terrain, and there are no unusual geological features that would create thermal updrafts." But the results were undeniable. My corn crop, which had been dying in July, was now the healthiest in the county. The plants were tall, green, and showing excellent ear development, while neighboring farms continued to struggle with drought conditions. Local media picked up the story, and soon I was fielding calls from reporters, scientists, and curiosity seekers who wanted to see the miracle farm for themselves. The attention was overwhelming, but it also brought validation for what I was experiencing. My family's attitude began to shift from mockery to grudging respect. "I don't understand what's happening," my Aunt Sarah admitted, "but you can't argue with results. That corn looks better than anything we've grown with full irrigation." Jake was less gracious but equally impressed. "It's probably just a temporary weather anomaly," he said. "Don't get too excited about one good year." But I was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about weather. Grandpa's journals contained references to similar phenomena dating back generations, suggesting that the unusual rainfall patterns were part of a longer historical cycle. The most intriguing entry was from 1923, written by my great-grandfather. The old Lakota chief told me this land was sacred to his people, a place where the sky spirits blessed the earth with rain when the ceremonies were performed correctly. I thought it was just Indian superstition, but I'm starting to wonder if there's more truth to it than I realized. I began researching the property's history, looking for clues about its significance to the original inhabitants of the area. Chapter 7. The Sacred Ground. My research into the property's history revealed that it had indeed been considered sacred by the Lakota Sioux who had lived in the area before European settlement. According to tribal historians I contacted, the land had been used for rain ceremonies and was believed to have a special connection to the sky spirits. Your grandfather's land sits on what we call a prayer ground, explained Robert Crow Feather, an elder from the local Lakota community. Our ancestors performed ceremonies there for generations, asking the spirits to bring rain during times of drought. The ceremonies had been disrupted when the land was claimed by white settlers in the 1880s, but the spiritual significance had never been forgotten. Tribal oral histories spoke of the land's power to call rain, even after the ceremonies had stopped. The spirits don't forget, Robert told me. If someone approaches the land with the right intentions, with respect for what it represents, the blessing can return. I shared Grandpa's journals with Robert, and he was amazed by the detailed weather observations and the references to spirit lines across the property. Your grandfather understood something that most white farmers never learn, he said. The land isn't just soil and water, it's a living entity that responds to how it's treated. Robert offered to perform a traditional blessing ceremony on the property, explaining that it might help strengthen the connection between the land and the sky spirits. I was skeptical of the spiritual aspects, but I'd seen enough unexplained phenomena to be open to possibilities beyond conventional science. The ceremony took place on the autumn equinox, with Robert and several other tribal elders conducting traditional prayers and offerings at specific locations across the property. They identified the same spirit lines that Grandpa had marked in his journals, confirming that the unusual weather patterns followed ancient pathways of spiritual significance. The land recognizes that you're trying to work with it instead of against it, Robert explained after the ceremony. That's why the rain comes when you need it. You're farming in harmony with the natural and spiritual forces that govern this place. Whether the explanation was scientific or spiritual, the results continued to be remarkable. My corn harvest that fall was the best the property had seen in over 40 years. Chapter 8. The Harvest of Vindication. When harvest time arrived in October, my corn yield exceeded everyone's expectations, including my own. The crop averaged 180 bushels per acre, better than most irrigated farms in the region and nearly double the county average for dryland farming. The grain elevator operator couldn't believe the quality of my corn. "This is some of the best grain we've seen this year," he told me as the trucks were weighed and tested. "Whatever you're doing differently, you should keep doing it." The financial results were equally impressive. After paying for seed, equipment, and operating expenses, I netted over $80,000 from my first year of farming, more than I'd made in 3 years at my previous job. My family's attitude completed its transformation from mockery to amazement. Jake, who had been the most vocal skeptic, now wanted to know my secret for successful dryland farming. "There's no secret," I told him honestly. "I just planted corn and hoped for rain." "But the rain only comes over your property," he pointed out. "That's not normal. There has to be some explanation." I shared what I'd learned about the land's history and the spiritual significance it held for the original inhabitants. Jake's reaction was typical of most people. Polite skepticism mixed with grudging acknowledgement that something unusual was happening. "I don't believe in that spiritual stuff," he said, "but I can't argue with your results." Maybe there's some scientific explanation we haven't figured out yet. The local agricultural community was equally divided between those who attributed my success to luck and those who believed there was something genuinely unique about the property. But regardless of their explanations, everyone agreed that I'd proven the land's potential for productive farming. The extension agent who had been pessimistic about my chances now wanted to study my farming methods for possible application on other marginal lands. "We need to understand what factors are contributing to your success," he said. "If we can replicate these results elsewhere, it could revolutionize dryland farming in this region." But I suspected that what was happening on my property couldn't be easily replicated. The combination of historical, spiritual, and environmental factors seemed unique to this specific piece of land. Chapter 9. The second-year test. The real test came the following spring, when I had to decide whether the previous year's success was a fluke or the beginning of a sustainable farming operation. The entire region was still experiencing drought conditions, and meteorologists were predicting another difficult year for agriculture. My family and neighbors watched with interest as I prepared for my second planting season. Some were openly skeptical that the unusual weather patterns would repeat themselves, while others were curious to see if I could maintain the success of my first year. I decided to expand my operation, planting 140 acres of corn and 20 acres of soybeans. It was a calculated risk. If the localized rainfall didn't return, I would face significant losses on the larger acreage. The planting went smoothly in April, but May and June passed without the miraculous storms that had saved my first crop. By early July, my plants were showing the same stress symptoms that had worried me the previous year. "I hate to say I told you so," Jake said during one of his visits, "but it looks like last year was just a lucky break. You might want to consider crop insurance for next year." Even I was beginning to doubt whether the phenomenon would repeat itself. The rational part of my mind acknowledged that unusual weather events rarely occurred in predictable patterns, and that I might have been foolish to base my farming strategy on what could have been a one-time anomaly. But Grandpa's journals contained accounts of similar cycles throughout the property's history. The unusual rainfall didn't come every year, but it appeared with enough regularity to sustain farming operations over the long term. "The blessing follows its own schedule," he'd written in 1967. "Sometimes it comes early, sometimes late, but it always comes when the land truly needs it." I decided to trust in the pattern that Grandpa had documented, continuing to care for my struggling crops while hoping for another intervention from whatever forces governed the local weather. The answer came on July 20th, when familiar clouds began forming over my property once again. Chapter 10. The Believers and Skeptics. The second year's rainfall pattern was even more dramatic than the first. Instead of isolated storms, my property received regular precipitation throughout July and August, while the surrounding region remained locked in severe drought conditions. The contrast became so stark that it attracted national media attention. Television crews, newspaper reporters, and documentary filmmakers came to witness what some were calling the miracle farm, and others dismissed as an elaborate hoax. Dr. Martinez returned with a larger research team, installing sophisticated weather monitoring equipment across my property and the surrounding area. Their measurements confirmed what everyone could see with their eyes. Atmospheric conditions over my 160 acres were consistently different from neighboring farms. "We're documenting temperature, humidity, and pressure variations that shouldn't exist over such a small area," she reported. "There's definitely something unusual happening here, but we haven't identified the mechanism that's causing it." The scientific community was divided between those who believed there must be a rational explanation and those who suspected the measurements were somehow flawed. Several prominent meteorologists published papers questioning the validity of the research, while others defended the data and called for expanded studies. My farming success continued to vindicate Grandpa's faith in the land. The second year's harvest was even better than the first, with corn yields approaching 200 bushels per acre and soybeans producing equally impressive results. The financial benefits allowed me to pay off my operating loans and begin investing in better equipment and infrastructure. I bought a new tractor, updated the farmhouse, and even installed a small irrigation system for the vegetable garden I'd started near the house. But the attention was becoming overwhelming. I received dozens of calls each week from reporters, researchers, and curiosity seekers who wanted to visit the property. Some offered substantial sums for the right to study or film the unusual weather phenomena. I began to understand why Grandpa had been so secretive about his observations. The land's special qualities were real, but they were also fragile. Too much attention and exploitation could potentially disrupt whatever delicate balance maintained the unusual conditions. I started limiting access to the property and declining most interview requests, focusing instead on farming and maintaining the respectful relationship with the land that seemed to be the key to its continued blessing. Chapter 11. The Expanding Phenomenon. By the third year, something unexpected began happening. The unusual rainfall patterns started extending beyond my property boundaries, bringing moisture to neighboring farms that had struggled with drought for years. Jake was the first to benefit from the expanding phenomenon. His farm, which bordered mine on the east side, began receiving irregular but significant rainfall that allowed him to successfully grow dryland crops for the first time in decades. "I don't understand what's happening," he admitted after his first successful harvest in years. "But I'm not complaining. Maybe whatever's affecting your land is starting to spread." Other neighbors reported similar experiences. Farms within a mile radius of my property began experiencing improved rainfall patterns, though not as dramatically as what I continued to receive. The effect seemed to diminish with distance, creating a gradient of agricultural success that centered on Grandpa's old fields. Dr. Martinez's research team expanded their study area to include the neighboring properties, documenting the gradual expansion of the unusual weather patterns. Their findings suggested that atmospheric conditions were somehow being influenced by factors originating on my property. "It's as if your land is acting as a catalyst for broader meteorological changes," she explained. "We're seeing increased cloud formation and precipitation across a growing area, but the effect is strongest at the center and weakens toward the edges." The tribal elders I'd consulted weren't surprised by the expanding influence. "When the spirits are honored properly, their blessings spread to benefit the whole community," Robert Crow Feather explained. "Your grandfather's land was always meant to be a source of healing for the entire region." The expanding phenomenon brought both benefits and complications. My neighbors were grateful for the improved growing conditions, but the increased attention from researchers and media made it difficult to maintain the quiet farming life I preferred. Agricultural officials from the state and federal government began pressuring me to allow expanded research access, arguing that understanding the phenomenon could benefit farmers throughout the drought-stricken region. I found myself caught between the desire to help others and the need to protect whatever delicate conditions maintained the land's special qualities. Chapter 12. The Responsibility of Stewardship. As the unusual weather patterns continued to expand and benefit more farms in the area, I began to understand that my role had evolved beyond simple farming. I was now the steward of something that could potentially transform agriculture throughout the drought-prone regions of the Great Plains. The pressure to commercialize or exploit the phenomenon was intense. Agricultural corporations offered millions of dollars for the right to study and potentially replicate the conditions on my property. Government agencies wanted to establish research facilities that would bring hundreds of scientists and support staff to the area. But Grandpa's journals contained warnings about the dangers of treating the land as a commodity rather than a sacred trust. His research into the property's history had revealed that previous attempts to exploit its special qualities had always resulted in the loss of those very qualities. "The spirits give their blessings freely," he'd written, but they withdraw them just as quickly when the land is treated with disrespect or greed. I decided to follow Grandpa's example and maintain the land as a working farm rather than a research facility or tourist attraction. I continued to limit access and declined most commercial offers, focusing instead on sustainable farming practices that honored the land's spiritual and environmental significance. The decision wasn't always popular. Some neighbors who were benefiting from the expanding rainfall patterns wanted me to do more to encourage research that might make the effects permanent and predictable. Others worried that my conservative approach was limiting the potential benefits for the broader agricultural community. "You have a responsibility to share this gift," one local official argued. "If this phenomenon could be understood and replicated, it could help farmers throughout the region deal with climate change and drought conditions." I understood their arguments, but I also understood that the land's blessings came with conditions that couldn't be ignored. The unusual weather patterns were part of a larger spiritual and environmental balance that required careful stewardship rather than aggressive exploitation. I established a small foundation to support sustainable agriculture research and education, providing funding for projects that aligned with the principles of environmental stewardship and cultural respect that seemed to govern the land's special qualities. Chapter 13. The legacy continues. 5 years after inheriting Grandpa's worthless land, I've learned that true wealth isn't always measured in dollars and cents. The farm now generates substantial income and has helped revitalize agriculture throughout the region, but its greatest value lies in the lessons it teaches about patience, respect, and the importance of working with natural forces rather than against them. The unusual weather patterns continue, though they've stabilized into a predictable cycle that benefits farms within a 3-mile radius of my property. The scientific community has largely accepted that the phenomenon exists, even if they can't fully explain its mechanisms. Dr. Martinez's research has contributed to new understanding of microclimate effects and the complex interactions between atmospheric conditions and local geography. Her work has influenced agricultural practices throughout the region, encouraging farmers to pay closer attention to natural patterns and traditional knowledge. The tribal community has been instrumental in maintaining the spiritual aspects of the land's stewardship. Robert Crowfeather and other elders continue to perform seasonal ceremonies on the property, maintaining the connection between the land and the sky spirits that seems essential to its continued blessing. My family's attitude has completely transformed from mockery to respect and admiration. Jake now farms his own land using principles he's learned from observing my methods, and he's become one of the strongest advocates for sustainable agriculture in the county. "I was wrong about that land," he admitted recently, "and I was wrong about you. Grandpa knew what he was doing when he left it to you." Nadun, the farmhouse has been restored to its original beauty, and I've married a woman who shares my commitment to sustainable agriculture and environmental stewardship. We're raising our children to understand that they're not just inheriting a farm, but a responsibility to maintain the delicate balance that makes the land's blessings possible. The old journals that started this journey now occupy a place of honor in our home, their pages filled with observations and wisdom that continue to guide our farming decisions. I've started keeping my own journal, documenting the ongoing relationship between the land, the weather, and the farming practices that honor both. Every morning when I walk through the fields that my family once mocked as worthless, I'm reminded that the most valuable things in life are often the ones that others overlook or dismiss. Grandpa's dry land taught me that patience, respect, and faith can transform apparent failure into extraordinary success. The rain still falls when the land needs it, and the crops still grow with a vigor that amazes visitors and scientists alike. But the greatest miracle isn't the weather. It's the understanding that we're all connected to forces larger than ourselves, and that true prosperity comes from working in harmony with those forces rather than trying to control them.